Hello and welcome to episode 163 of Tall Guy Talks Travel with Rick Doherty. Of course, I am your host, Rick Doherty. On today's show, I'll be joined by my good friend Maz for the second straight week as we continue our 3-episode conversation about Mary Poppins, Saving Mr. Banks, and Mary Poppins Returns. Last week, we got things started by talking about the original 1960s Mary Poppins movie. That's where we'll pick things up on the show today. Maz and I were just starting to talk about what happened after the Banks children ran out of the bank, and Mary and Bert needed to find their own unique ways to bring the family together as a unit.
You know, there's that line that she has where it's a person through no fault of their own can't see past the end of their nose. And I think that's so important because it doesn't place the blame on Mr. Banks. It's not saying he's this bad person who doesn't want to help people or doesn't want to take time out of his day to do these things. It's just like you said, he's so focused on his job. And part of that is part of him being a father. He's the provider for his family. He sees this as his duty. So, when he talks about the life I lead, it's just a core part of who he is being able to be successful in this position, not only because the status it provides benefits their family, but the money it provides benefits their family as well. It allows them to lead this lifestyle. And, kids aren't going to know that. His kids aren't going to be like, oh, wow, thanks for working so hard for us, Dad. They don't see that. So it kind of works both ways, which I think is really special because the kids can't fully appreciate what Mr. Banks is going through. And Mr. Banks is in a position where he can't fully appreciate how the kids are feeling. And so playing those back to back off of each other, I think really sets up the crux of the movie. And it's just so important to keep in mind that it's just one of those rare movies where there isn't really a traditional villain, because it's just people doing their best and being misguided along the way until they get helped back along onto the right path.
And that makes Bert meeting with the children, finding the children running through the alleys. And then it's Bert who explains to the kids that their father is trying his best and maybe he's not succeeding, but saying, you know what, when you get to be an adult, things get more complicated. And they can hear that message from Bert because Bert isn't burdened with as much as Mr. Banks, but he can still empathize with him. Probably the reason that Bert is a jack of all trades and he's doing art and he's selling kites and he's a one-man band and all of those things is because he knew how hard it would be to live Mr. Banks' life and he checked out of that. But that doesn't mean that he doesn't appreciate how hard it is for him. And he could bridge the gap between Mr. Banks and the kids because he still had that childish disposition, but he was still living in the adult world where he had to find ways to make money. So all of that really fits together in like this perfect puzzle piece that leads us first onto one of the best scenes in the history of movies, which is the dancing on the rooftop scene, and then leads to the entire purpose of the movie. But let's talk about that scene on the rooftop because I think this is what people think of when they think of Mary Poppins.
Yeah, I mean, when you talk about something being so incredibly choreographed, like this is the perfect example of great choreography. You cannot help but be pulled into this number. It's so much fun. It's this beautiful meeting of, the whimsy and the impossible happening. And then at the same time, you get what looks like these very real sets. You don't have any of that, like, oh, this is green screened kind of feeling looking at it. You have all these people working together, creating
I wonder if that
this.
will come up in the Mary Poppins Returns episode.
Gee, I don't know. um it's just it's just so well done. And and I think it reflects the whole movie in this same way, but it doesn't feel dated at all. Like you don't watch it and think that it feels out of time. It still feels like something that could be a modern, choreographed number today.
One thing about Mary Poppins that a lot of movies that never seem to go out of style have is when you are looking back on the past, that's a movie that's hardly ever going to feel old because we're always looking at that era with nostalgia. That era is always going to look not perfect in our eyes because it still looks better than pictures we have from that era. So in our minds, it's just part of the throwback, part of the nostalgia. And nostalgia doesn't age as poorly sometimes. It doesn't age as poorly as something that is based in the era in which it's being made.
Yeah, definitely. And I do think, some credit is due to cinematography as well. It's just such a beautiful film. I rewatched it before recording this, just because I wanted it fresh in my head. Like I don't have the whole thing memorized. And it still strikes you how beautiful some of these establishing shots are. It really looks like art. And it's amazing. There's one shot of when Mr. Banks is walking up the steps into the bank, and you would not in a million years be like, oh, that's going to be a beautiful shot. And yet it is almost breathtaking in how artistic it looks. And you get this gloom and you get this emotion from it. You know exactly how you're supposed to be feeling just from looking at this establishing shot of a building. It's just so well done.
And that actually brings up something that I was going to hold off for the next episode as well, which is talking about the cartoons mixing with the live action and how they did that so well way before Who Framed Roger Rabbit. I mean, this was 20 some years before Who Framed Roger Rabbit. And does it look as good as Who Framed Roger Rabbit? No, but it's still like completely and totally overwhelming how good it does look. Another thing about the whole step in time chimney scene that I think is underrated is there's definitely an element of Mr. Banks never really even notices when Bert is in the room, when he's interacting with Bert. There's a class divide between the two of them. And there's definitely a vibe that Mr. Banks looks down on Bert. And the people in the bank think that this is, their world. This is their London. They are building London. They are giving out the loans that are keeping the British Empire going. But then up above them, it's a world where the working class guys are king. It's a world where Bert and Mary, a nanny and a chimney sweep, they feel like they are the ones who are building and maintaining and keeping London going. And a lot of that symbolism, you don't get it when you're 5. You get it when you're older. But I think that's a really important scene. And even when Bert is giving Mr. Banks the advice that ends up leading to Mr. Banks being a better father, Mr. Banks isn't even really paying attention to, like, he's almost thinking he's thinking these things up while Bert's just in the room. It's so incredibly well done. And you don't notice it when you're watching it as a kid, but when you're watching it as an adult and you're just like, wow, why did they put this much effort into a kid's movie?
Because it wasn't just a kids movie. It was an everybody movie. But no, you're exactly right. And I think that A Man Has Dreams song right at the end is another one of my favorites because I mean for everything that you just said. And I think when Bert is singing to Mr. Banks about his kids and you see it sort of start to click on Mr. Banks's end. But it's not even really like you said, like he's really taking in what Bert has to say so much as he's acting like he comes to this on his own, which we see throughout the movie, with, you know, taking the kids to the bank in the first place and Mary kind of tricking him into that idea. But in this case, it's just this really beautiful scene to me. And I love that it's Bert, this chimney sweep that he probably wouldn't give a second glance to, who really is, at the heart of this movie, along with Mr. Banks, and able to kind of reconnect the family.
And then that leads to the one that hits me every time. I can hear this song out of context and it will have me bawling. Listen, I have been 100% open in the fact that the household in which I grew up was not the best of households. And when you see Mr. Banks have it click during Let's Go Fly a Kite, and when he realizes, sort of the error of his ways, this movie isn't about the Banks children. This movie isn't about Mary Poppins. It's not about Bert. This movie is about Mr. Banks. And he is the one who has the character growth because let's be honest, I mean, Mary's practically perfect in every way. Bert's had it figured out for a while. The person who needs the character growth is Mr. Banks. And when he finds out that it's not all about just going to work, just making sure that the kids are perfect and they, come down to greet him as he smokes his pipe at the end of the day or whatever. One of the best scenes in movie history.
Oh, without a doubt. I mean, yeah, when you see that click and you get the emotion from the scene to begin with, but then the music hits and you get that emotional swell with the music too. And it is really, really impossible for me, at least, not to cry during that scene because it is just so absolutely perfectly done. And when you see the Banks family, skipping off down the road, all singing hand in hand, it's just beautiful.
And I think the end of the movie, as well as the Uncle Albert scene, really set up my style of comedy with one of the best jokes ever told in a movie. I once met a man with a wooden leg named Smith. What's the name of his other leg? Such a great joke.
It's the best.
I just think about how they ended this movie. And then, of course, Mary leaves because she filled her purpose. And it's just the perfect ending to a movie. Like they wrapped up the perfect movie in the perfect way. And I think what everybody was thinking is, well, what will happen when the Banks children grow up and will they need Mary Poppins to come back again, right? I think
All right. You know
that's
what?
the only question at the end of this movie.
So everyone was clamoring for.
We'll get to Mary Poppins Returns in a future episode, but we are going to now turn our sights to Saving Mr. Banks, but not just the movie Saving Mr. Banks, but sort of the real life story behind how Walt eventually got this movie made, because he had been trying for 20 some years to get the rights from P.L. Travers to the Mary Poppins books, to the Mary Poppins story. So you've read the books, or at least some of them, correct?
Yeah, I read them. I read them when I was pretty young. Which is funny. Mary Poppins is like at this intersection of all my favorite things. So I did have to read that series, and I really enjoyed them. Um, but they are very different than the movie that we got for sure.
So reading those books, can you see why Walt really wanted to grab this movie?
Absolutely. The books are a little more episodic, where it's a little more focused on like all these adventures that Mary is having with the kids. And as a kid reading these books, they're so well written that you do get caught up in the adventures yourself. And she's going on these just absolutely fantastical places with these kids where, there's statues coming to life and there's magical times that they slip in between to celebrate a Halloween party. Like there's all these really wild things happening and they're all so magical that it makes perfect sense that, Walt's kids would be enamored with this series and then that he could get caught up in it as well. Um, and even changing it like he did for the movie, which I think was the right choice, it keeps that whimsy and the magic to it. But yeah, the books are very rooted in that it's such an adventure, every single thing they do.
And P.L. Travers herself was a very interesting individual. She, like I said very recently, like I had an interesting background in my household. She had a similar situation. She had an alcoholic father, so she needed to have a nanny. And this is sort of based on her nanny in some way or another. Obviously, that's going to get to one of the questions I was going to have for you. So, this is probably a good time to answer this question. Did the Banks children and Mary Poppins and Bert actually go on those adventures?
Yes.
Okay. So
I
in your head canon, they actually jumped into the chalk picture and they didn't just not I don't want to say imagine it, but it wasn't just a game they were playing with Mary Poppins that they remembered in the future. It was literally the magic of Mary Poppins.
yes. And I think that, that's how it is in the books. It is that Mary is this very clearly magical being who is able to kind of slip in between time and in between places, and she does have magic to her. And I think it's just more fun to see it that way, that they're actually doing all these things. I think that makes it more exciting. And I know, so for PL Travers, a lot of it was based off of games that she used to play. Like, she used to play these very imaginative games as a child. And I just think, I don't know. I'm the fantasy fan too. So for me, the idea that you can actually have this magic happening is going to win me over every time.
I'm not arguing with you. I think everybody gets out of this movie what they want to get out of this movie. Like, I think it tells you a lot about how you view the world. I think I've always been more of their imagination was so good that they were almost writing stories. Like, I remember one time somebody said to me, "Why do people get so excited going to Disney? They're, and meeting Snow White. That's not really Snow White." And I'm like, "Well, yeah, it is." Like, and they're like, "No, that's just some person in an outfit." And I'm like, "But you don't understand. It's both. It's both of those things because in your mind one thing, but you also know no, this isn't just a person in an outfit." Like, so it wasn't that they imagined it, it wasn't that they made it up. It was that they were writing their own stories, and those stories were as real to them as we viewed it on the screen. That's just how I take it. But everybody has their own reading of it, and everybody has their own purpose to it. And that's probably why we love it so much. Now, in the books, does Mr. Banks play a major role?
Yes, which is funny because I don't, it's been quite some time since I've read the books, and he definitely plays a role, but it's not as pronounced as it is in the movie. And I think part of that is to do with the kids in the book are very, very different than the Jane and Michael we know in the movie. Um, they're actually kind of bratty. They're not the best kids. So they do need a nanny a little bit more. And there's a lot more kids. I think by the end of the book, there's 5 Banks kids. So she like kind of keeps coming back for the younger kids as Jane and Michael get older. Importantly, though, I don't know. I just feel like this might be important to mention. P.L. Travers never wrote Jane and Michael as adults for some reason. I don't know why.
And of course, they needed to write Jane and Michael as adults, as we'll talk about.
Hmm.
The foreshadowing that you are dropping about how much you don't like Mary Poppins Returns is quite impressive, actually. So let's talk about the movie Saving Mr. Banks. First of all, there are a lot of things that I really love about this film that I'm just going to get out of the way that have nothing to do with what we're discussing. When they go to early 1960s Disneyland, which never happened, it was just completely made up for the movie. That happened in my mind. Like the way you view them jumping into the chalk picture. That's how I view P.L. Travers and Walt Disney riding the carousel in Disneyland. Such a great scene. Having him just handing out the little cards that had his autograph on it. The fact that Disney made a movie that kind of pokes fun at Walt in some ways and shows him as not being perfect. They don't show him smoking, but there's the one scene where you hear him coughing from off screen. Those are some things about Saving Mr. Banks that I love that have nothing to do with how this movie got made.
Yeah, I agree. And I'm going to piggyback off that and say the casting for this movie was, I mean, it could not possibly have been better. And maybe this is a controversial opinion. I think it's Tom Hanks's best role. Like, I think this is his best work that he's ever done and probably ever will do.
Wow. Okay. Let me think about that for a second. So he won the Oscar for Forrest Gump, which was completely overrated. Philadelphia didn't age that well or as well as they thought. He's really, really good in A League of Their Own.
Yes.
But yeah, I mean, it's not the money pit. Yeah, so I guess I would have to say that this is definitely one of my favorite Tom Hanks performances, even if it's not his best. I don't think I'm watching Tom Hanks. I think I'm watching Walt Disney. And that's impressive considering how much I've seen of both of those two people in my life.
Exactly. I think that's why it's so good to me because you do forget it's Tom Hanks and like we've seen a lot of Walt Disney things and Tom Hanks as well because how can you not? But for him to embody Walt so well that you forget you're watching a performance is so impressive because that's not easy to do.
Emma Thompson is really good in this. I'm going to throw out a side character who is an actor that I really love. I love The West Wing. I loved Studio 60 on the Sunset Strip. Bradley Whitford absolutely knocks it out of the park in a small side role in this. The great Paul Giamatti as the limo driver really has a great relationship with P.L. Travers, seems to be the person who understands her when nobody else really understands her. And then you get that incredible scene where she signs the book for the daughter. And I don't want to blow too much of the movie if you haven't seen it, but you'll get to that scene and you'll absolutely be blown away by it. What do you feel about the way they actually portrayed just the nuts and bolts of trying to get the movie and trying to have the movie made?
Oh, I loved it. PL Travers is notoriously difficult. Like she is known for not being the easiest person to get along with. And I love that they kept that tension there. And they did keep her struggling with aspects of, Disneyfying her books. And I really loved her going back and forth with Walt. I love seeing that. And I love the scene, not to give too much away because it happens early in the movie. I love the scene where the rest of the writers realize that Walt doesn't have the rights and that they need her approval on everything to sign off on the rights still, even though they're making this movie. I just think that's so, so brilliantly done.
And of course, in the last episode, I talked about how I'm not really a fan of the song Supercalifragilisticexpialidocious, but I'm happy that it exists because we got one of the funniest scenes in this movie where she says, "That's a made up word. Unmake up that word. We don't use fake words in this movie." And you just see one of the Sherman brothers slide the sheet music for Supercalifragilisticexpialidocious under some of the other sheet music. Such a sly and subtle thing that was very, very funny. I want to talk about the fact that this movie, I hinted towards it in the last episode. Walt Disney was a capitalist. He was America, America, America. He was, you go into Hall of Presidents and there's a lot of pictures of him with Eisenhower and with Nixon. There aren't a lot of them with Kennedy and Johnson. That's all I'm saying. And this movie, however, is, I heard it once described as, if anything, it's socialism curious. And Walt, being somebody who definitely had his points of view and definitely had his opinions, I think in this movie you can see that he's not as rigid or as binary as maybe sometimes he is portrayed. With hindsight, he definitely could see that everything's not perfect with the banks. And he wasn't even the money guy. Roy was the money guy. So he was always the dreamer anyway. What are your thoughts on that dynamic that I think is really interesting?
Oh, I think it's great. I think that it's like, I think it almost gives you a peek behind the curtain because there's this Walt that we all know and have seen from media and press and things like that. But then there's Walt, who was Walt. And I think this movie spends a little more time establishing him as a person and less as focusing on the fact that he's, the Walt Disney. And I really love those little glimpses of humanity that you get from him, where I shouldn't say humanity, the glimpses of vulnerability that you get, that even though he's this giant, he has Disney, it's huge. You still see inside him a little bit more in this movie. And there's a few key conversations. I don't want to give away too much that really kind of let you peek at the person he was and maybe form some opinions on why he behaved some of the ways he did.
Last thing I want to discuss on this topic of saving Mr. Banks, and that is, not to try to spoil it too much, but PL Travers in the movie cries at the premiere because she's so moved. In real life, she cried at the premiere because she hated what they did to her character, this character that she loved so much. Is that just a little bit of, Disney revisionist history that, Disney's making the movie, you're going to get something like that? You have to expect it to have some rose-colored glasses to it.
Yeah, I think it's what happens when you make a movie because it doesn't matter who's doing it. You want a character arc, like you want a satisfying conclusion to a character arc. And that is the satisfying conclusion to PL Travers' character arc throughout this movie, of her being resistant to making the film, her eventually caving, and then her seeing it and, being satisfied with it and being moved by the emotions. That's the arc you want to see. So I get why they did it. I think it makes perfect sense. It's a movie. But yeah, in reality, she hated it. She was so mad. And it's funny to me because obviously we love the movie, but she was so mad about it that when it came time to make the musical, she specified that she didn't want anyone who worked on the movie working on the musical, only people from England were allowed to work on it. And yeah, and they they weren't allowed to have the Sherman brothers write any music for it. She wanted it to be this totally different thing. And up until when she passed, she maintained this mentality of like, well, it exists. And like that's as good as it got for her. Like,
She
well, I've
did
made my
start
peace
to
with it.
write some of the things that were created in the movie into the books, from what I understand. Because she did continue to write Mary Poppins books after this.
Yeah, she did. She wrote four more maybe. I don't quote me on that. She did write several more. I think it's like an 8-book series total. One of them is a recipe book, which I find very interesting. Um, it's just so out of the norm for her.
Hey, if there's anybody you want teaching you about cooking, it's the English. No, I know
Yeah.
she was Australian. But anyway, you just mentioned satisfying conclusions. And if you want a satisfying conclusion, come back next week when we finish our 3-episode conversation about Mary Poppins with a rant from Maz on Mary Poppins Returns. That will be next week. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Do me a favor and make sure you're subscribed to the Tall Guy Talks Travel with Rick Doherty YouTube channel. You can see videos from Epcot's International Flower and Garden Festival and dining reviews from the 2 major Irish restaurants at Walt Disney World and Universal Orlando Resort. After a move, I have set up my at-home studio in my new place, and we have a lot planned in the new environment. Some of those plans will involve my co-hosts Maz and Sarah Says. There are a lot of reasons to make sure you are following along with all of us. This has been episode 163 of Tall Guy Talks Travel with Rick Doherty. Maz will be back on the show next week when she really gets ready to rant. The two of us will finish the 3-week Mary Poppins discussion by talking about Mary Poppins Returns. She certainly has some strong opinions about that flick. That will be next Thursday on Tall Guy Talks Travel with Rick Doherty. Until then, have a great week.